Hi, I'm Kurt Doolittle. This is for the Proprietarian Institute. This is continuing the video series on the method. This is part of the introduction, and we're going to answer the question, well, we've done all this work, so what's the problem we're trying to solve? So let's talk about it. Now, you'd think that this is, if I'm writing about law or philosophy or whatever, or the scientific method, the end result wouldn't be that I'm talking about war. But yes, we're solving, the problem we're trying to solve is war. It's war, yes, really. It's part of the conflict of civilizations. It's an ancient war. It's probably as old, it's probably more than 5,000 years old, maybe older than that. But it's a war we're losing again. We lost for 1,500 years, and now we're losing again. And so the transformation, or the shift of crime and warfare from fast, direct fraud, violence, theft, and war from without has been to slow, indirect fraud, theft, and war from within. Or in strategic terms, the shift of crime, conflict, and war from military war, physical war, to total war against every aspect of civilization, including and especially its institutions of cultural production and persistence. Well, what does that mean? Is that obvious enough, or do I need to cover that a little bit more? We tend to think, like Pinker wrote this book, The Angel, Better Angels, and I think that's just a terrible book. It says, well, because there's violence, there's less bad. Well, there's less violence, but there's more bad. The difference is that in the earlier stages of the world, most of our assets were stored up in physical things, and most of our cultural dependency was local, and it was dependent on personal knowledge. But as we've gotten bigger and civilization's gotten more complex, now our assets are out there in the ether. We have we have fragmentary interests in all sorts of things, and we aren't dependent any longer on people who agree with us or are related to us in defense of many of those assets. So warfare today doesn't need to be, and hasn't needed to be, conducted against physical means. Warfare can be conducted against every other means. Why? Because our means of producing cooperation at scale isn't dependent on how much grain we have in a bin in the backyard in a jar buried so that nobody can steal it instead, it's not dependent on how many cattle we are going to protect from raiding, or even based on whether our fields are going to be burned, or whether the state's going to overtax our crop production, or whether we're going to be held hostage by members of the church. It doesn't make we're not in a world where physicality is necessary to produce violence against our demonstrated interest. And our demonstrated interest are all those things we depend upon as individuals, as families, as clans, as tribes, as nations, as civilizations. We're not dependent upon fixed goods as much as we are this fractional distribution of everything that we've indirectly depended upon for success. Hayek came around and he said, and he won the Nobel Prize for this, and he wrote this wonderful little book on the dangers of socialism. But the reason he was trying to get across is that we are more dependent upon insubstantive habits, traditions, manners, ethics, morals, knowledge, metaphysical presumptions today than we have been certainly for the past 400 years, than we were in the past. We're dependent on things that are beyond our perception, economies, vast international distributions of production, distribution, and trade. We're getting our information not from people we trust and have common interests, but from people we don't trust and we don't have common interest with. It's one of the problems with having a big country is is the politicians have to lie in order to create a message that is anywhere near desirable. So we are in a position where warfare has shifted from what we think of as military warfare to the destruction of the means by which we cooperate, the means by which we persist. So it's more of a war of sedition and a war of erosion than it is against dramatic physical warfare. This is similar to what the raiding method of raiding warfare. So when Islam expanded, they could go out into raid cities, raid trade routes, and then withdraw back to the deserts on their horses. And the same thing could happen in the steppe. Withdraw back to their horses in the desert, and then they would erode the ability of people to form complex trade networks and eventually cause the collapse. This is the same strategy you use to siege a castle. You just do it on a broader area over longer periods of time with bigger networks. It's the same thing that would happen if your neighbors boycotted you, or if you were a member of a little tribe and they ostracized you. This is the means of warfare by undermining. So if this has happened, why is this shift possible, and why have we been so vulnerable to it? Well, we've been vulnerable for a bunch of reasons that are fascinating in retrospect, horrific. Fascinating on the one hand because we can understand them, and they're reasonable reasons for us to fail, but they're frustrating in the sense that they sort of sit in our blind spot. All cultures have one because all cultures are dependent upon organizing the mind of people to make certain categories of decisions and ignore others. And so we're very vulnerable for very good reasons. The same reasons that make us evolve faster than all civilizations combined, produced higher trust than all other civilizations combined, and live a higher standard of life than other civilizations, is that we is the same thing that creates this vulnerability. So let's start talking about it. So we have a failing in cultural self-understanding. Our culture is very complex. If you try to read why the social scientists failed, you finally get to Dumézil. How do I pronounce it? I'm sorry. And he's discussed European trifunctionalism, which is a market competition between the three priesthoods of the faith, of the law, and of the military. And so these three priesthoods sort of maintain a market of power between them, whereas most other developed a hierarchy. So this market between them is a market between everybody, is why we practice markets. Markets are the most rapid means of evolution because they encourage the most trial and error, which produces the most discoveries, which produces the most opportunities for expanding those discoveries for consumption by more and more people in that society. So we didn't understand what was making us function. And the church made it worse by not telling the truth about what was making us function and developing a monopoly, just like the woke PC Marxists today have created an illusion. The Christian culture created an illusion, just like the Jewish culture created its own illusions, just like the Muslim culture created its illusions. The only people it's not really clear the Indians have any illusions. It's just sort of a wonderful sort of they're living in a world that is about analogy rather than falsehood, and the Chinese are living in a world where they're just deal with reality as empirically as they can, and they use all sorts of harmony and nice words to cover up the brutality of it. So we fail to understand ourselves. Nobody wrote a Bible of Western civilization. In fact, if you want to understand the West, there's no equivalent of the Jewish laws or the Muslim laws. Well, there is now, but I mean, hasn't been. And so the problem was that we didn't know what was making us successful, so we just did it out of habit and tradition. So we did it. It was spread across hundreds of books and different authors and indirection, and it was competing between the state and the law and the faith and the superstition and the science and the commercial sector, and these things were always running back and forth against each other. So we never consolidated our trifunctional civilization to something that we could protect. So we weren't able to defend ourselves because we were ignorant of what it was we were protecting. We thought of it as moral, but we've got it backwards. What we determined was moral was our strategy, and we didn't know what our strategy is. So the reason Westerners haven't been able to explain themselves is a combination of the complexity of our group strategy, the fact that nobody ever wrote it down, and the church created a reverse lie to actually help undermine it. So when these things go together, you get into this problem of course we're open to vulnerability because we don't know what it is we're defending, and people can play undermining games against us by making various claims, and we can't defend it. So what I've tried to do is put that law into the European Lex Legis Europae, which has put together the law for us so that we do know what that strategy is and we can defend it. But if writing it down was simply harder than writing everybody else's down, because you can't write it down as an analogy. You have to write it down as science, because that's what we do. So the second thing is that we got a little too full of ourselves during the expansionist period. Everybody does this. But the church did the church scholastics did a very good job of trying to reform Arianism, using the church as an excuse for continuing the Arian tradition of conquest. And they did a very good job of it, and they succeeded largely. But we took this into this Christian ethic, and we took this Aryan expansionary ethic, heroic ethic. We added the Christian excuse to it that we were doing good, and we created white man's burden, so to speak, in the various instances of it, and we tried to raise ourselves and mankind. Now, they did very different jobs of it, although the colonialism lie is, as Sowell will tell you, is absolutely false. You absolutely do want to be an English colony. You may not want to be you may want to be an English colony more than a French colony, but if you were neither a French or an English or Dutch colony, you are far worse off, and you always would have been far worse off than you would have if you were one of those colonies. Because just as Hong Kong is better off than the rest of China, the best thing you could do is be an English colony. Now, you may not like the disruption that it causes, but the conditions that result from that disruption, that's what creative destruction is. It's change that produces a higher level of productivity per capita and allows us to have more choices and endure less suffering. So the colonialism project wasn't a negative. The biggest problem with the colonial project was that it met with the Jewish success at communism in Russia, which put Germanic Europe under threat once again, and caused the horrific consequences of the world wars that left the colonial project undone. Had we finished the colonial project, we would have discovered what you always do, is that it's extremely unprofitable. You want to get out of that business as soon as possible, but we would have made all our profits from basically the regulation of banking and trade, which we're the most high trust civilization and could do. So that would have been the beneficial outcome of it. But in any event, we got very full of ourselves. The First and Second World Wars, where we were demonizing Germany, were falsely, well, not entirely falsely, but falsely, that we obtained a false sense of superiority, of goodness, out of that process, just as we found a false sense of self-virtue out of conquering and decimating a continent. So this virtue signaling tended to be a curse. It's a kind of resource curse. A resource curse is like Russia has a resource curse. There's lots of resources, so they don't need to modernize as much as extract money from resources. It's the problem the Gulf Arab countries have, and they're finally figuring out they can't do it forever, which is if you have resources, then you try to make money off resources instead of innovation productivity and production, and so then you end up filling the resource curse. This is a problem Australia has, is they keep talking about this, about Australia's resources, they don't realize it's a curse. And so what's really valuable in your Western civilization is our culture, which is the thing that's being undermined by the disinformation campaign. So this virtue signaling turned out to be a kind of resource curse. We were too full of our own virtue resource, and we overlooked what was going on, and we thought that our victory or our success was inevitable. It was a different version of the inevitability of Christianity or of Islam, or the inevitability of the global world, but it was an inevitability that we would. But none that never plays out. Countries basically succeed based on population demographics, resources, and trade routes. And if you can mobilize yours better than others, you raise higher quality of life, and relative to others, you can encounter more debt, conduct better wars, more defense, control more trade, more banking, more finance, and continually generate prosperity in a vicious cycle until the point which corruption and overexpansion and too much credit have put you in a position where you're vulnerable to the shocks created by someone else repeating what you just did. So just as China is doing to the West right now, America did to Europe and created the Great Depression of the 1870s. So this is a normal process that's been continued. We see the rise and fall of great powers all the time. The Austro-Hungarian, Spain, France, England, America. So things just happen as normal cycles because all human organizations do the same thing. They exhaust all opportunity for exploitation of personal satisfaction until they reach a limit where there is no free capital necessary to reorganize the country. Well, one of those kinds of capital is virtue signaling, and we thought we had it, and we didn't. The second thing was our failing of tolerance. There's a frailty. There's a problem with our foundation principles, which is, we call it liberty and freedom and democracy, but it's actually it's a militia, all members of which use the promise of violence to ensure the self-determination by self-determined means of all other members in the militia or the army or the whatever warrior band, and they ensure each other as self-determination because that prevents anybody gaining enough power to be able to extract from others, and it forces everybody into meritocracy. Anybody who's willing and able to fight and do that, and who has the money to buy the horses, the chariots, and the metal to do that. So, which is what made the French Revolution possible, of course, is the arms were now, arms are cheap, guns are cheap, and guns made it possible to defeat knights. So the cost of joining the militia dropped to the price of a rifle. So, in any event, we have a frailty there because granting people the right to self-determination grants them the right to make mistakes. Markets survive on the fact that people can conduct trial and error and make mistakes. But we don't have enough laws in our civilization, Islam certainly developed a lot of them, against abuse of people's rights to self-determination by self-determined means. In other words, that we didn't protect people against various kinds of fraud, baiting into hazard, nor did we protect our civilization against various kinds of fraud and baiting into hazard at scale. So not only did we not protect individuals, we didn't protect the government, we didn't protect our nations, and we didn't protect our civilization against the failings of too much tolerance from this. Christianity made it far worse because Catholic and Protestant Christianity make it worse because they're universalist. Orthodox Christianity at least puts the state, says, well, we're here as a partner to the state. They don't take universalism over the nation. So you will find that Orthodox churches, the Russian Orthodox Church is for the Russian people. This is how it should. If If Christianity was like that, the Catholic Church wouldn't have become a third world religion, wondering why the New World is crumbling, and that we're desperately looking for a religion, whether secular, pseudoscientific, or supernatural, right now, because our church has failed us in reforming, and it's gone and followed the money into the third world. Not that for the Catholic Church is very frustrating, because the problem of the Catholic Church as being a Church of Europe was eminently solvable, and there was just nobody out there in the 1800s to do what they did in do it throughout its history with the through the three major reforms that happened. Just no thinker emerged in the church to reform the church. And so the church died, and it's in its death throes right now, and it's become a religion of the third world instead of the church mature into the first world. Orthodoxy did it. Excuse me, I drank too much coffee. Orthodoxy has made an interesting choice in that they never tried to compete with the state. See, the Catholic Church tried to be the state. The Protestant Church tried to eliminate the state, and the Orthodox Church tried to partner with the state. This turned out to be the right solution. I'm not advocating any particular form of Christianity. I'm just saying that the relationship between a religion and a state was best handled by over time by the Orthodox Church. So in any event, there is a frailty to Christianity, which is universalist, which is the worst possible thing. It's one of the reasons Islam is destructive. And if you take that and you take the church out of it, you make it fundamentalist Protestant evangelical, which doubles down on fundamental and super. Whereas the Catholic Church essentially combined science and natural law by the time of the Scholastics into really, mirroring our traditional law and fully incorporating our traditional law, like it fully incorporated the Greek thought and fully incorporated the Greek restoration of thought. And they put this moral law together that was simply natural law in churchy prose. And it was pretty good stuff. I mean, it would still fly today if you realize that it can be taken either fundamentally, like there is a God, or you can take it analogistically, like if there was a God, this is exactly what he would do. That would work. The Catholic Church would have had that reform, but they failed. They failed because they followed the money. And they doubled down on it. So the Protestant Church has actually had the same problem, is that they've got these fundamentalists running around who are essentially, are just as destructive, because they are waiting for a savior, or they're become so submissive that they won't fight to protect their civilization, and they're participating in the openness of our civilization to these methods of war by undermining, because frankly Christianity was brought into the Roman Empire in order to undermine it and destroy the institutions of the ancient world, just as Marxism, postmodernism, Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, anti-male feminism, PC, woke, anti-colonialism, anti-white, white hatred has become brought into the Western world by the same process, and it worked its way up through women and the underclass, or at the time in the Roman world was the slaves, just the way it worked its way up in this era, until the point where there's power to be had by men by making use of this false narrative to be able to manipulate, to obtain power on these people's behalf. So it's the same damn product of warfare against West that worked in the past, which is why we know it's so dangerous. We're so vulnerable to it. So our tolerance is rarely is not a good thing. It's a bad thing. The failings of our government, there's a problem also with our kind of government. An oligarchical government is a middle-class government. Well, the middle-class rule is the best because the middle class is the only class that needs to have everybody prosper in order for itself to prosper. So you always want to have middle-class or oligarchical rule of some sort, but you want it under rule of law. Well, this is the problem of the capitalism-socialism debate. If you don't have rule of law, you have capitalism. If you have rule of law, you simply have rule of law, and you have capitalist means of production that aren't parasitic or redistributive or any kind of thieving on people. But if you have insufficient government and insufficient rule of law, the oligarchy or the middle class will eventually expand to the point where it's trying to continually increase its size to the point where it has to engage in immoral activity in order to keep the growth, the promise of growth, which is the promise of growth, which is keeps the myth of the American, what we think of as the American dream, but it's the European dream. It keeps it alive. So every time you get an oligarchical civilization, you produce this. So our government didn't have sufficient rule of law because it didn't have sufficient cultural understanding so that we could prevent the abuse and of a rule of law from what we think of as moral trade to immoral capitalism. That's a failing of our government. It's a failing of our government because it's a failing of our own understanding of what we do. Lastly, it's a failing of our, like as I just illustrated, a failing of our law. Now, our law is really old. I mean, it's thousands of years old. It's gradually held the same thread throughout it over time, and I'll go into later why that happened. But our law, by the time you get into England, which invents the modern state, is pretty amazing. They have the rule of law. They have a contract between the rulers and the people, the middle class, the nobility, and then as property ownership expands, they create the House of Commons to bring in more people. So anybody who's invested, a shareholder in the state or in the government and the territory, those people have some sort of say. But it was an interesting system because those people didn't have democracy. They didn't vote to do something. Their right was to veto movements by the king. In other words, the monarchy, which was a business owner, went out and said, I want to raise this money to make this investment, and they were either yay or nay, and they got pissed off if they got nay. Well, that's a good thing. That's exactly how. So it was a rule of law with the optimum method, which is you can have rule of law, you can run a government, you can run it as a corporation on behalf of the people who are vested in that corporation and who want it to persist and who want it to work together to produce commons, but you can't just extract from them without having a justified excuse for producing returns for them. So we had the best system of government. I mean, we had a rule of law. The parliament eventually took over most of the functions of electing the cabinet. This leaves the monarchy in the ideal position, which Elizabeth is in today, of a judge of last resort, which is what you're trying to get into. You want a person who can say, that the law says the king or the queen is outside the law, and what it means outside the legislature, and has the right to abandon any legislation in order to restore rule of law. So this is why England developed the best state, is because they had this system, although the post-war era has tried to destroy the ultimate form of government ever invented. We tend to think that American government is better. It's quite a bit worse. It worked for accidental reasons. The only thing that's superior about American government is that the Constitution is written so that it becomes an empirical transaction system that you have to produce accounting transactions against to modify, and that we have the Supreme Court that is adherent to that Constitution that can constrain the government. That was the idea. That part is better than what the UK had, but the UK has the monarchy to say, okay, you guys have all blown it. I'm restoring rule of law, and the monarchy's only defense is the military and the people. And as long as the monarchy's always self-interested to do that, so they do. If you haven't read Hans Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed, if you can work your way through his libertarianism, it's quite good and quite informative, because kings really do have the best, monarchs do have the best. European Christian monarchs under rule of law with parliamentary systems who can veto it, with judges who are independent, who protect the people and the Parliament and the king from laws or abuses. That works the best. So we have about the best system of government here. Unfortunately, we have vulnerabilities because our law is incomplete. The the Founding Fathers wrote it down, but they made a rights-based law without explaining that those rights were derivations of the common law, and that the common law was an expression of self-determination by self-determined means, by a militia of individuals who insure each other at the cost of their own lives against the usurpation of that law of sovereignty and reciprocity and demonstrated interests that give them the ability to pursue self-determination by self-determined means, the consequence of which is the most rapidly evolving civilization possible for man. The last sort of mistake we made was we had domesticated war. It's hard to think of that. Europeans are really good at war. We've always been. The Indo-Europeans were the greatest warriors. They invented a certain kind of maneuver warfare. Europeans have been excellent at war by producing a professional military and a militia, a professional militia that defended each other in exchange for rights and rights of citizenship. So this system worked very well. The problem is that over the Middle Ages, we gradually, for a variety of reasons, domesticated war until we reached the Peace of Westphalia, which essentially made states responsible for all members of all people within their territory. It used to be that the church or a group of knights or this guild could start wars, and they did. We had the wars of religion weren't wars of religion; they were wars of the birth of the nation state. But we ended up pacifying religion, and there were all sorts of ritualistic aspects of warfare, like you hold people hostage to ransom them, etc. There were sorts of laws of war. There were ethics of war, etc. And this, by the time we get to the Second World War, the World Wars, we've got the laws of war, and we've got the human rights. So now their contract for human rights. So not only have we said, okay, you're responsible for what you do, your people in you do, and we're limiting the war to the conduct by the states, but now we're saying the states need to respect their own damn borders, and the purpose of a state isn't to war for territory because agrarian lands are the only way you can get wealthier. It's instead to focus on the modernization of your people and building a market society, because market societies tend to have too much interest in commercial interaction with each other to engage in warfare between them. Not that that's true under democracy, because democracies have gone to war just fine, but that was the basic idea. So we domesticated war. Likewise, in our law, we spent a lot of time domesticating male violence. We've had 50,000 years of domesticating male violence. Male violence is direct. But one thing we didn't do is that who is responsible for managing female warfare? So females, under the common law, gossiping, shrilling, undermining, these were crimes, just like violence was a crime. So a woman could end up in the stocks for being what we think of as a Karen, just as easily as a guy could end up in the stocks for being, violent. So this was our traditional way of doing it. But when we ended the paternal responsibility for the women of the household, and we entered women into the franchise, we didn't continue to regulate women's method of warfare as we continued to down-regulate men's method of adversarial warfare. Likewise, we didn't defend against total war against the institutions of cultural production as we defended against military war. In both of these cases, we took the false virtue signal, we had the false resource of our own virtues to not defend against the natural behaviors of men and women to conduct warfare differently, of people, given that men and women overlap in personality traits. Some men have very feminine minds, some women have very masculine minds, but in the general, we still tend to conduct our conflict in warfare, women as social and interpersonal superpredation, and men as political and violent superpredation. And so that predation scales, and so you can use the men's method of warfare to scale from the interpersonal to the social to the political to the international, just as you can use the female method of warfare to scale from the interpersonal to the social to the political to the international. So our war was incomplete. We had too much virtue of our belief in our own virtues, that we had, overcome the nature of man, and that we had domesticated war, but our institutions of understanding warfare, understanding our law, understanding our government, understanding our middle class, understanding our reasons for success, and understanding our culture, we just didn't know those things. So we didn't defend them correctly against the method of warfare. China practices total war. Islam practices total war. Judaism practices only the female method of warfare. They don't do it they do it over there now by male method. They practice the female method of warfare. The people who don't seem to do a lot of this stuff are the Indians, and they're the only not crazy people on the planet right now. Russian warfare is a mixture of Eastern and Western, where they are happy to invest heavily in undermining, but what they are really doing is using delay and deceive until they can use force to seize an opportunity. So the Russian method of warfare is a kind of stalking, whereas American warfare continues the English tradition or the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition is the minute you see a problem, you need to go solve it while it's cheap. So hopefully I spent 30 minutes on explaining what the problem was. Hopefully I've beat it down. I'll bet you the rest of the slides are duplications of what I said here. So if you read The Culture of War by Martin Van Creveld, I've met Martin. I love this man immensely. He's a good historian, but he's a really good person, and I find him really very interesting and honest. People and institutions conduct war on different terms with different victory conditions. So you can't defeat an enemy on your conditions. You have to defeat an enemy on their conditions. So if they conduct female method of warfare, you have to eliminate their ability to conduct the female method of warfare. Just like if they conduct the male method of warfare, you have to conduct the female method of warfare. If they do the compromise method of warfare, which is what China does, which is delay and deceive while accumulating significant forces, so that at the time they actually pull the rabbit out of the hat, it's too late, then that's their intermediary method of warfare. So you can have undermining, delay and deceive, or direct resolution, or anything in between. These are methods of warfare, and civilizations conduct warfare by different means. Islam just wears away like China, the Chinese water torture. They just destroy a civilization from without and within through raiding against physical assets, raiding against political assets, and raiding against cultural assets, and trying to undermine your lower classes to turn against the upper classes in exchange for some self-perceived status, despite the fact that the result of Islam is always ignorance, decline, destitution, and dysgenia. So we can war against all sorts of things: the military, the government, the people. We can do it against the infrastructure, production, and the resources. We can war against the economy, trade, and finance. We can war against institutions of cultural production, like norms, traditions, values, self-narrative. We can war against knowledge and information, and we can not war against reason itself. Now, if you go through the neo-Marxist POMO, anti-male feminism, PC woke, anti-colonialism, anti-white hate movements, you'll find that that's what they've done. They've essentially warred against the institution of cultural production, the knowledge and information, and reason itself. But it's warfare. It's not dispute. It's not disagreement. It's war. And we know that because we know what the difference between imposition of costs upon the capital interest of others are. And we know that these things are of value, and they're the means by which our assets are protected, and the great quality of life we have is dependent on these intangibles more so than they are in the tangible territories. And the more advanced your civilization, the more it's dependent upon those intangibles. Well, we've used incremental suppression. I love this. I get teased for this all the way. I don't know why I get teased for this term all the time, but law is a means of evolution. It's the evolution of incremental suppression of means of conflict, war, crime, unethical, immoral treatments. And we use the law for that purpose, and the law is really good for it. One of the reasons the law is good is it writes down some rule that can't be abridged so that it's re-referenceable and not forgotten. Constitutions are very good for this. People love to quote the Declaration, the Bill of Rights. Well, if you used our Bill of Rights, which we would reform, it would have a lot more detail to it and a few more rights and obligations. It would have the obligations and the inalienabilities that you for each one of those rights, but would also have those rights based on the natural law of reciprocity and self-determination by self-determined means, so that you couldn't fudge with those rights. Those rights are fudgeable right now. The right upon which all other rights depend is the right to bear arms. That's the first right. But they don't put that in there as the first right. That's what makes all the rest of the rights possible. And that's why they're trying to take it away from you, from us, because it is the foundation of Western civilization's right to self-determination by self-determined means. So we've had 50,000 to 10,000 years of institutional development almost entirely to domesticate men and with family and children domesticated women, but we've had a century of institutional development completely licensing conflict and warfare by women and the women's means of warfare without family commons, norms, traditions, and children domesticating women's warfare. So we have let loose this particular Pandora. We didn't realize it because we thought we were virtuous. We believed the nonsense of the Enlightenment, who said, well, everybody can join the aristocracy of everybody, and we believed the Marxist false promise that everyone was virtuous. This is, again, a cognitively female method. And instead, what we've done is we've let loose the destruction of the institutions of cultural production by a particular intuition that's common in naive people, that their concept of what's possible when you're organizing large numbers of people is simply infantile, or it doesn't scale. So if you look at the column on the left, crime and war, I list a spectrum of crime and war. You'll see me run through this list all the time. On the right, speech in furtherance of crime and war. And you'll notice the gray box at the bottom starts with seduction by baiting into hazard, with false promises. So this is much of what we'll talk about is the use of this means of fraud to seduce people with false promise, to undermine, to cast as oppressive the laws of the universe, and to undermine the individual using we'll learn what GSRM is later, and canceling, undermining information with disinformation and propaganda, undermining truth, reason, and science and laws of the universe, undermining the institutions of cultural production with the practice they call critique is just means of creating disinformation to undermine the institutions of cultural production, and total war against all our institutions. So we are at war. This war is made possible by the weaknesses I've illustrated, and we are conducting a war, and we are somewhat blind to the fact that it's war. And we'll have to leave it up to the psychologists to do the research to figure out why so many people are vulnerable to it. But other than the historical reasons I've illustrated. So what's our goal is civilization's conflict for a variety of reasons, some of which are self-interest and some of which are natural. I mean, we have natural competitive interests over scarcity. Some of which are cultural. Well, the way we do things, it suits me, and the way I know and the way you do things and suits you is the way you know. But these things end up being incompatible. Some of these differences are biological. There's biological differences in the distribution of the generations of man. We call them races, but it's really generations, and so we have a big difference in those we have a big demographic difference in those things, even though the difference between people in the elites in each is marginal. The difference in the size of the underclasses in those differences as civilizations is different, and the size of and the distribution of the population, or its mean, is what generates demand for norms, institutions, and values, because you have to have something that most people can work by. So, each civilization uses a slightly different method of warfare dependent upon that demographic distribution, their location, their historical evolution of their institutions, what technology had available, and what resources were available. In the Middle East, for example, developed an insurrectionist method of warfare that allowed the Arab Muslims to destroy the 5 great old civilizations of the ancient world: North Africa, Egypt, Levant, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Persia, North northwest Indian, and even the Persians. They came back twice. Finally, the Arab Muslims disturbed the Persians once again. When the Persians rose again, the Turkish Muslims struck them down at the time. So the natural evolution of the Indo-Europeans through the Persians to domesticate the Middle East was unsuccessful, and Arabization continued. The Shah was the last attempt, and unfortunately, I don't have enough data to tell you what's possible now. But while they still are Indo-European, they're sufficiently Arabized that it may be very difficult to rescue Persian civilization. The Jewish Christians used a similar technique to destroy the ancient Greco-Roman world. Their methods were to destroy the institution of cultural production. Muslims did it from without by conquest. Jewish Christians did it from within by false promise and sedition. But their strategy was the same, which is to destroy the institutions of cultural production, destroying meritocratic, empirical, rapidly evolving civilization of the Indo-Europeans, generating demand for an authoritarian system like they were used to, and which is more comfortable for the lower classes who cannot compete in market civilizations, and the result is superstition, stagnation, decline. In Europe's case, it was the Dark Ages from which the Romans would have recovered, but because their institutions of cultural production were destroyed by the Jewish Christians, they weren't able to bring it back. The European Jews continued this strategy of warfare from within in Spain and Germany and Ukraine and Russia, resulting in the communist movement, 100 million dead, and they came to America in the post-war era with the same intent of turning the black Americans. The capitalism could save the laboring class in Europe and in Russia, but their belief was it couldn't save the black Americans. This is turned out to be fairly true because of these demographic distributions, not because there's something wrong with any given race, but some races have very large underclasses and a very large underclass. Like when we talk about race in America, it's really about class. We're complaining about the underclass, and they use this to weaponize the black Americans against the dominant power structure to destroy the cultural institutions. It's just as they had used the underclass in Russia with their false promise of freedom from the aristocracy, resulting in gulags and 100 million dead. So they said what they were going to do. They planned, organized, financed it, and they did it. So we're solving a repeat of a long-standing method of warfare between the Middle Eastern method of war and the European method of war, and the European method of civilization, which is rapidly evolutionary, and the Middle Eastern method of civilization was rapidly devolutionary. So the other two, the Africa is still in its process of transformation, but as long as it's Christian, it looks like certain parts of Africa are doing well. India, there's nothing wrong with India. India just needs a little more time and to control its underclass population. The 300,000 to 100 billion in my lifetime, that's crazy. 300,000 to 1.3 billion or whatever it is now in my lifetime is somewhat crazy, and it's no wonder that the government can't keep up with producing commons for that rate of growth of an underclass that can't possibly be employed because the equilibration of skills in the world has all but distributed now that communism has been abandoned. So China's always been a powerhouse in the world, but they have always had their own problems. They have a bit of advantage because they're essentially an island. Eastern China is essentially an island surrounded by oceans, deserts, and mountains. And so that they have an advantage being there and isolated, so Judaism and Christianity and Islam couldn't get there, so the Chinese aren't as predisposed to wishful thinking as we are. They think just the opposite. They're quite skeptical, and so they're trying to contain Islam, which is, of course, we're objecting to, but it's not clear that we're doing the right thing. So every civilization tried to do this differently. The difference is we're very far from China. We might have a dispute with China, but realistically, it's going to be dispute over which kind of advantage. Do we take a meritocratic advantage, or do we take a civilizational state advantage? That's the conflict. There's no conflict to have with India. I mean, we'd be just as happy to to triple India's state of wealth because they're not an aggressive civilization like China is or the Middle East is. They're not harmful to neighboring pieces. Islam is a religion of destruction and conquest, and it leaves behind dysgenia in decline. India is a beautiful civilization. Unfortunately, it's too beautiful because it makes itself vulnerable. China is an interesting civilization. They do a lot of things right, but they're militantly expansionist because they have a horrendous chip on their shoulder, somewhat justifiably. But then, we look back at history and say, wow, we shouldn't have done that. Let's not do that again. And China doesn't look at it that way and say, we shouldn't do that either. They say, well, we get to do it now because you did. So we have a different conflict going on there. So our Western weakness, which I've covered a little bit more, is that European civilization is very expensive. It's psychologically, emotionally, it's status expensive, it's competitive and adversarially, and the virtue of Christianity being added to us is that we took Stoicism, combined it with Christianity, created this silly narrative, and if the church hadn't risen out of it, we just had another polytheistic cult for the underclasses, it would have been perfect, because what Christianity does is lets you to find virtue in your contribution to the commons through charity and love of one another and tolerance of one another, instead of by commerce or war, which is what the upper classes and the middle classes were doing. So you could move yourself out of the low status under this religion. It was something that was necessary because, frankly, the aristocratic world was very unkind. I mean, the reason the aristocratic world worked like it did, the Romans and the slaves and the Romans and the Greeks and the rest of the Greeks and the slaves, is because these people had started out as domesticating animals, and frankly, they thought of wild humans as just another animal to be domesticated. The difference was that these animals could be turned into members of the society if you worked with them long enough. So this is why slaves had a route to progression, serfs had a route of progression, because it's too expensive to maintain a slave. What you really do want is you want freemen. The problem is you can only allow freemen into this community who aren't going to be more harm than they are, do more harm with their freedom than could be prevented by keeping them under the manorial system, which is someone's responsibility. So Europeans, by accident, so in other words, it's a very we live in a very expensive civilization. It's psychologically, emotionally, intellectually expensive. It requires us to work quite hard. And this is a counter to every other group. Every other group is more clannish than we are, so they come here and they act clannishly, and they don't feel like they can integrate, and this is difficult for them. So because they are not willing to abandon what they did before and come here, because we're not allowing that. This is a civilization where we've destroyed clannishness and tribalism, and you have to fully integrate in order to participate and gain the gains. So Europeans, by accident of our history on the steppe, more so than all other civilizations combined, discovered, adapted to, and applied the formal physical, natural, and evolutionary laws of the universe and the behavioral consequences of self-determination by self-determined means, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This because they had no other choice but entrepreneurial organization and entrepreneurial warfare, producing what we incorrectly call democracy. This is because, like, if you have a river valley that floods, this creates demand for irrigation, which creates demand for authority, which creates demand for regulation, which creates the ability to tax, which creates the ability to fund an army that can be hierarchical. But if you don't have that, if you're out on the steppe and you're managing herds and you live in basically a yurt on a great big cart drawn by oxen, and you migrate around, there's no one to tax. Everything has to be maintain this distributed dictatorship of sovereign men. So for our reason, we developed this form of government, and it's just stuck with us. And it's a good thing, because it's actually we're the only people to do it. And of the Indo-Europeans, we're the only people to make it survive into modernity. And even in modernity, we're under assault, and even on the continental Europe. And we're still being invaded by Islam after a brief respite. We were at war with Islam for 1,500 years, and they're reinvading Europe again. Judaism has been undermining European civilization for 2,000 years, and they're undermining us again. So these are natural conflicts that are civilizational differences, each civilization thinking it's doing the right thing or doing the best interest or pursuing holy writ or whatever. But the answer is the laws of the universe. If there is a God, God's laws are written in the fabric of the universe. We know what those laws are. We're going to cover them here in this program. So it's not open to debate anymore. The reason the Europeans evolve faster than the rest, and evolution is your reward for doing the correct thing, is that we simply obeyed God's laws. Discovered, obeyed God's laws, and we didn't lie to ourselves about them. We paid the cost of it. And the Greeks developed tragedy in order to explain it. So that's why we have tragedy in our civilization. That's why we have honor. These are means of compensating for the fact that we live in the most expensive, psychologically, emotionally, materially expensive civilization in order to generate all these commons. And it's a tragedy. God didn't make a universe for us. If he existed, the universe is all but hostile to life. It's a vast, irradiated threat to life where we're only kept in place by a few accidents of solar history. So life is a tragedy which we overcome with our heroism and with our care for one another and our insurance of one another. And this is the secret of the West, or at least the Western aristocracy, as it slowly tried to domesticate ordinary man. By the end of the late Middle Ages, the use of manorialism, at least above the high now line, had destroyed most of the underclass through whatever, just because they couldn't reproduce fast enough, and the middle class had bred down into the working classes, working and laboring classes. That meant that when we moved we opened up the continent, we could move vast number of genetically middle class Europeans over into the American continent and liberate them from what they had been before. That's different. In other words, we could mobilize a middle class with resources. The rest of the world can't do that because they're largely burdened with various large underclasses who can't be mobilized and who blew the opportunity for rapid growth by rapid self-modification of generating self-demand of their economies under capitalism. Instead, they tried to go for communism, and they blew it. And now China has seized the ring at the end. So, in any event, this civilizational order produces that most rapid evolution that's possible, and it explains the disproportionate rate of our civilization compared to all others. The weakness is the right to self-determination doesn't defend us against bad decisions, and moreover, it doesn't defend us against seduction, entrapment, and addiction, and worse, we don't defend ourselves against war by these kinds of methods of warfare, sedition, undermining, because those are free choices, and the middle class rule that is necessary in our civilization doesn't defend itself against overextension, and we need to fix those things. So it's not like it's like once you understand the problem is fixable. The problem is getting to where you can implement the fixes, because everyone resists change, even if it causes them to pay a cost. So the enemy's strategy then is to continue delay and deceive. They use incremental undermining by delay and deceive. They hide behind the false virtue or false moral claims. Where the Chinese rely on their cultural institution of the ancient method of accumulate forces by delay and deceive without, the left uses the Semitic or the Middle Eastern method, which is the female method of warfare, to undermine institutions from within. This is why you can't let them in, because they're at war with you every moment they're with you. So there are four. Let's talk a little bit about how this seduction is performed, how the lies are made. The problem we're solving is there are four sciences. At least that's how we break it down. I used to say, well, logics aren't a science, but they're the precursors to the science, but it doesn't matter. For our basic purposes, we can say the formal, linguistic, logical sciences. We can use them to describe the physical or material sciences. We can use them to describe the natural or behavioral sciences and the evolutionary or survival sciences. That means that we can use the present tense, in other words, some logic, to describe the before condition, the physical, the during condition, the actions we take, and the after condition, the consequences of our action. The rest of human speech is just idiomatic prose, ordinary prose, narration, fiction, fictionalism, deceits, frauds, and seductions, all sorts of things we use to negotiate with each each other, lie, cheat, deceive. But just to focus for a minute, the rest, how can we take advantage of those laws of the universe? Well, people can deny, evade, or defraud. They can submit and adapt to them, or they can compete against, try to discover, conquer, and apply them. And you'll find that civilizations tried this. The Middle East tried to evade and defraud, and they paid the cost. The India and China tried to submit to and adapt to. They pursued harmony, and the West tried to compete, discover, conquer, and apply those laws. So you see the different rates of our development is relatively related to the choice that we made. Now, if you want to know why we made that choice, every civilization's anchored by the relationship between the first aristocracy and the underclass. So if you value the underclass, you need them, you're going to have a certain relationship with them. And so the difference between these three situations is the size of the underclass in Europe, non-existent, in China and India, China very small and India very large, but they handled it through the caste system, and in the Middle East by simply huckstering. I mean, there's not a. They say, well, we found Göbekli Tepe and we found these first. This is the origin of organized religion. Except they're forgetting this. It's the origin of hucksterism, because that's the original false promise. So the first profession may have been prostitution, but the first criminal profession was huckstering, and that huckstering is what we call priesthoods. So the most advanced method of evolution is to discover, conquer, and apply those laws. We call this truth. When we say Western civilization pursues truth, it means we pursue what's correspondent and consistent with the laws of the universe. The most advanced method of cooperating with those laws is called submission or harmony. So you can choose what China and India both chose harmony. And they produced wisdom literatures. Again, I need to understand India better because they had everything going. I just don't understand what happened. I think I do, but I'm not sure. The most advanced method of evading those laws is to socially construct a falsehood and ignore them. It's kind of deferral, and that's called the pursuit of salvation. In other words, you're making it about something else other than reality. And the most advanced method of abusing those laws is to profit from the social construction of falsehoods that profit from the false promise of evading those laws, and this is called fraud, or sophistry, or supernaturalism, or it's war at scale. So in other words, the Middle East chose the worst possible method, and then when they reformed, they turned it into a method of warfare, just as China chose delay and deceive over time, accumulating mass, just as the West chose skill and maneuver, or the OODA loop. So there are four. They use these. They take, given those four natural laws, systems of law. They're for bodies of laws of the universe, or for sciences. We're trying to solve the four big lies: the false promise of freedom from the formal laws. There's no truth, or everything is relative. By the use of social construction of repetitive feedback of information that counters it. In other words, the delay between the false promise and the consequence of false promise is fairly long. So just like you get an addict enjoying some alcohol or drugs or whatever, or behavioral addictions, what happens is the consequence of their addiction shows up quite a bit later. So this is what they're doing. They're using a false promise to huckster people into a belief that they can have something good when the consequence will be later, and it will be too late for them to reform. The second is the false promise of freedom from the physical laws. This is the false promise of end of scarcity, of endless growth, the fact that we're going to be richer and richer tomorrow forever, and that there's an end to scarcity, an end to human competition because of scarcity. The third is the false promise of the freedom from the natural laws, or the behavioral laws of self-interest, rational choice, the natural amorality of man, the demand for human reciprocity, the human behavior of altruistic punishment for our competitive organizations, the false promise of the end to kin selection, coinophilia, the ethnocentrism, differences in sex, class, and subrace, racial differences, and the sexual, social, economic, and political value of organization by ethnocentrism given the class. In other words, ethnocentrism is the optimum mean of social and political organizing because they're the least resistance to redistribution and the highest potential for trust. So if you want to get to Denmark, you basically fill it with Danes. If you want to get to Norway, you fill it with Norwegians. And it takes the Norwegians and the Swedes are engaging in a wonderful experiment right now with bringing others in that are hostile, without the understanding that you can't sense the boiling of the frog until it's too late. Well, Americans, we sensed the boiling of the frog fairly early on. We failed. And then last one is the false promise of the freedom from evolutionary laws, like ending natural selection, entering markets as a peaceful means of continuing natural selection. The fact that a mutation accumulates in every generation because mutation is random. The impossibility of isolation, inescapable regression, accumulated genetic load that is just the results, and the fact that we're always in a war against the Red Queen of evolution, and that that war continues against resources competitors, biological alternatives, climatological, geological, solar, and galactic risks. So they are making these false promises, and it really comes with the Marxists, just like they made the false promise in the past, is that they have this tendency for magical thinking, and all this magical thinking is an attempt to deny the natural limitations on our behavior that are caused by our discovery of the laws of the universe. They use specific tactics to persist these lies. They never state their alternatives. They never state a competing alternative or their desired outcome that's open to equal analysis and criticism. So they're happy to critique, which is what they mean by critique, undermine your argument all the time, but they'll never oppose a solution. Although say they don't know, we should all just get together and work on it, which is like, okay. It's a convenient way of lying. I can't figure out if they're that naive, that dishonest, or that cunning. But it's getting together doesn't scale. That's the reason we have markets. It's the reason we have democratic governments, is because getting together doesn't scale. The second they use is faith healing. They deny the hazard. They psychologize it. They provide some sort of psychological relief while allowing the cause to persist, grow, and evolve. This is part of delay and deceive, is to provide faith healing, making you feel good in the moment and keep using these false promises to delay your counter reaction against their undermining. The next technique they use is false storytelling. They bait you into empathy by using loading, framing, obscurantism, suggestion, suspension of belief, and overloading. They're trying to get you to where they've given you enough narrative that you've engaged suspension of disbelief, that you're no longer self-regulating what they're telling you, you're envisioning it, and you're developing an empathy or sympathy with it, but you've abandoned all critical reason for it. So this is how why they tell stories. I can't wait till I have the opportunity to go through all these thinkers that are out there doing in public, because their stuff's all on YouTube now because it's easier to capture, and just edit it and show you how they're lying to you. The next station is called the false promise. They bait you into hazard because they make a false promise of freedom from those laws, and they argue with them. So they use what we call pill pull. Just like use critique to undermine you, they use pill pull or sophistry to advance their deceits. So they argue these things with sophistry or pseudoscience or theology or some side of moralism, but they're trying to delay and deceive you with creating a false promise so they can continue their undermining. They use false criticism, which is what we call critique. So there's critique is undermining into hazard, and they continue that when they undermine, they name all the faults of something. But yeah, those faults might be true, but what's the better alternative? Is there a possible alternative? Well, that's what critique is for, is to focus your attention on the failings and generate demand for authority to solve some problem, when the answer is every alternative is even worse. So they heap up this false criticism and they undermine people with hazard. And secondly, what they do is heap undue praise. So you'll find people heaping praise on all sorts of failed systems or finding exceptions to it, if onlys. Despite the fact that they are false. Now, I find this specifically true in libertarianism because libertarians are always heaping undue praise on these great thinkers, and they're like third-rate morons, and they heap great praise on them as if they're visionary. Well, the truth is what they're depending upon is the ignorance of the average person. This is true also of people like Einstein and whatever. It's the Einstein industry. But it's true in every discipline. You find the heaping of undue praise on people who they want to use as icons because they want you to empathize with the icon rather than look at the material causality that's behind it. The next thing is they use evading, and reflecting, which we put into the acronym GSRM, which is gossiping, shaming, rallying, ridiculing, moralizing, psychologizing, denying. I mean, it's all that stuff that they use to say that they, in order to pretend that their disapproval is equal to a falsehood. And then they hide behind plausible deniability. Well, I was only trying to do this. Well, I had good intentions. Well, no, I can't warranty that. No, I'm not liable for that. I thought I was doing the good thing. When the truth is they hadn't done due diligence, and they were trying to get away with huckstering. So those are the most common techniques at high level. We go into excruciating detail about all of this later on, just like we go into excruciating detail about truth. So our goal is restructuring our understanding of the world of ourselves, restructuring our logic from set logic to operational logic, fixing our law, our constitution, our policy, and our economy, and then most importantly, fixing our education for defense against this total war so that we can maintain our group strategy of self-determination by self-determined means and the rate of evolution that results in it. And we can restore a long history of dragging mankind kicking and screaming out of ignorance, superstition, hard labor, poverty, starvation, disease, suffering, early death, the tyranny of men, the vicissitudes of nature, and the general tendency of other human groups to stagnate and decline. But how can we do it? Well, warfare has been conducted by abuse of informational commons. That's what the law does. It defends property. That's what the state does. It defends property from without. The law from within, the state from without. So we can't, the military from without. So the warfare has been conducted, and we can institutionalize, make illegal all these kinds of lying that we cover in painful detail here. Now, people would say, how would you know that? Well, it turns out you can do it. That's the point of the method and why you want to learn it, is that we can use the law to sanitize the informational commons, and we can prosecute people who've conducted this warfare against us from within. We don't have to go around hanging people anymore. We can just impose the law. People that want to become good people will, and people that won't will leave, because the incentives are there in the law. And is it possible? Well, it's possible to convert freedom of speech to freedom of truthful speech and reciprocal speech. We can, when it's in the public, to the public, and matters public. In other words, we're going to still talk trash with each other in private. That's okay. That's not attempting. That's emoting. That isn't attempting to conduct a fraud. So we can do it, and it will work easily. We have always had the ability to do it. Our legal system is amazingly rapid adaptation. I'm not going to cover it here, but the rapid adaptation since the 80s that tried to get fewer and fewer people going to court by making the law clearer and clearer has worked. So specifically, can we restore defamation, false promise, baiting into hazard, informational fraud, and total war against civilizations of institutions of corruption, institutions of civilizational production? Can we end it? Can we end the industrial of lying and media academy politics that occurred in the 19th, 20th, and now in the 21st centuries by combining with their combination of pseudoscience, sophistry, mismedia, and vulnerabilities in law and constitution? Well, you wouldn't think so, but honestly, we can, and rigorously so. And why would we do it? Well, we could end the conflict, restore a civil society, or force ourselves once again to conduct trades, which is the purpose of a democratic government, is conduct trades between the classes, because that's the only virtue of democratic government in multiple houses, the production of a market for commons between the classes and, if necessary, the sexes and races. That's what houses are. They're markets for producing trades that produce commons. But however, those markets need to be protected from fraud, and our commercial market and financial markets need to be protected in fraud, just as our informational markets need to be protected from fraud and warfare. So I put this in a little symbol here. We're defending against and conducting total war by I got this wrong. Defending against the conduct of total war by military, economic, informational warfare from without, and legal war and seditious warfare from within. We can use the law to end that war on our people, our country, our civilization, and mankind. And in that law, we can mandate that the state protect us from these things. Once again, we can force everyone into the market for voluntary reciprocal cooperation in the service of one another, in the service of ourselves, instead of continuing going opposite directions. And we can once again transcend ourselves and mankind into the gods we imagined, and this time not falling for the Middle Eastern method of undermining from within or raiding from without. So that's our promise, is a fifth enlightenment, a renaissance. The impact of this would be as large as was the Indo-European innovation, the Greek reason and Roman law, Enlightenment empiricism, the scientific and industrial revolutions, and the consequence for mankind would just be as profound, because the rest of European civilization would have something to work with too, and others might. It's one thing to say that this is a great law for Europeans, but in truth is the science is good for everyone, and this is scientific law and government. Would that we could end over 2,000 years, it's probably more like 3,500 years, of warfare against Western civilization and the Western transcendence of mankind by freedom of deceit and freedom from fraud, deceit, baiting into hazard, and sedition and war. Well, I hope that was... I just wore myself out, I think. That was way too long, an hour and 15 minutes. Anyway, I hope it was, it didn't kill you. I don't know, maybe I'll have to break that one up. But anyway, that was the summer, that was explanation of the what problem we're trying to solve and the scope of it, and hopefully a summary of what we would do. The next section, which we'll cover, is the program itself and the components of the program, which tells how we accomplish it. I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Propertarian Institute. Thanks for sitting with me through that.